Okey doke. It is time for another wonderful day in environmental interpretation. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. We are continuing our discussion on what do we do with content. How do we take a look at all of this stuff? How do we get these things going so that we can get people connected with the most important parts of what's going on? That is, what's the meaning, what's the wisdom, what's the value, what's the importance of the thing that you're talking about? Not what are a bunch of factoids about it. So we ended off class on Monday, thawing out our fingers and toes, but also having a thought about, okay, so we've got a bunch of tree species around campus, each one unique and distinct. They're all sort of arranged near and far from each other and other interesting features on campus. What is anything we could do, anything at all, wide open question, to interpret 2 or 3 of these trees on any of these tree campus tours, instead of just having people walk there, reading a little placard that has common name and Latin name, and then going, how neat is that? Pretty neat, honey. Let's see if we can go find the next one. Okay? So that let's see if we can go find the next one suggests that the visitors, the participants, are having to gamify the interpretation themselves. So we're going to spend the balance of class today, after we sort of debrief that exercise, to think about some interp options for any of those trees, with a big elaboration on game design. So how many of you guys, gals, show of hands, have ever played a video game before? Yeah, me too. How many of you guys have ever played a game like tag? Childhood, like playground style games. Okay. Games are a pretty universal thing. In fact, you can pretty well trust that kids, in the absence of anything else to do, are going to come up with their own games, right? Turning sticks into swords and guns, or, finding rocks and playing princess with, I don't know, whatever. Like, kids are wildly creative, and they will they'll invest meaning into things that aren't necessarily meaningful for them a priori or at first look. Cool? Alright, so if you had any notes scribbled down on what you might do with any of those tree species, let's go through those now, bat around a couple of ideas, just to kind of see where people are thinking, and then we'll get into game design. So, does anybody have any ideas that were spurred on by Monday's very cold, but at least outdoor and active tree walk? Any ideas? So I'll get us started. With the pine that was right on Illinois Avenue, right on 51, we talked about how this pine is part of its environment. So we can help people understand one part of the value of that. Was it a loblolly pine? Am I remembering that right? Yeah. We can have folks start to understand any bit of importance about that tree in its context, not by focusing on specific characteristics of that as a loblolly, but as a member of its community. So this is a figurative language technique called personification, where we take something that is living or non-living, and we ascribe to it human characteristics. And more specifically, in interpretation, we would say we are talking about a living thing and ascribing to it specifically human characteristics, membership in its community, as humans understand it, not as like an ecologist understands it for non-human species. So we would call that anthropomorphization, a more specific form of personification that is specifically focused on living things being ascribed human traits, characteristics, personality, thought processes, motivations, whatever. Okay? Cool. So, we can help folks understand this loblolly as a member of a community, a member of our human community, attributional language, our human community, by talking about the things that this loblolly might be doing with us and for us. So, for example, when you have a tree, or lots of trees, right next to a busy highway, like Highway 51, 1 running north south through town. That pine's going to do a whole bunch of stuff passively all the time. Like, it's going to help filter out the diesel PM 2.5, 2.5 micron diameter bits of diesel dust that are highly carcinogenic and constantly getting sprayed across that side of campus by trucks, mostly diesel trucks. Over the road, like long distance trucks, not truckers, but a lot of diesel dust into the air. And there are a lot of health consequences associated with that. So when a pine tree has a bunch of that diesel dust blown onto it, those needles are a huge surface area to intercept and electrostatically attract and pull those things out of the air and gently rain them straight down where they can be safely sequestered in the soil. Not so safely if you're trying to grow anything in that soil, but at least it's not still blowing around into our lungs. 2.5 micron diameter particles are light enough to go hundreds of meters away from the emission point with even the lightest wind. So on a very windy day like yesterday, right, that stuff can be blowing all the way across campus. So it's filtering our air out. It's also filtering out noise. So trees act a lot like humans do in terms of their eco-acoustic profile. They absorb sound, like a lot of sound. You and I are each worth about 2.5 square meters of carpet acoustically. So I have to speak pretty loud. I have to put a lot of vibrational sound energy out into the world to overcome the effect of your shirt absorbing a big chunk of that sound. And trees are doing that, again, with that huge surface area of those leaves as well. So when you and I are more distracted, we're more sickly, we die earlier and so forth in noisy habitats, like every other creature on Earth, those trees are very passively keeping us alive. So with that particular example, maybe we construct a little story about the loblolly pine moving into southern Illinois and wanting to be a good neighbor. And so puts down its roots, sends up its shoot, and starts to make our neighborhood a little bit quieter and a little bit quieter and a little bit safer to live in. And that sounds like something a civic-minded person would do. So this is a pretty recognizable kind of a story or narrative that is taking a whole bunch of like ecoacoustics, the sound physics of fluids, like our atmosphere, and putting a recognizable, understandable, friendly, kind of human-like face or narrative to it. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's just one example, right? There are a million different other things that you could talk about just with the loblolly pine relative to other species, relative to its location. Again, in my case, next to the highway, or between the highway and us trying not to breathe in a bunch of diesel dust, and so on and so forth. So there's no wrong answer with these ideas. Does anybody have any sense of, yes, saw cool species across campus? I could envision some Interp along this direction for you out of Monday's classes and exercise. Anybody got some ideas?
I don't know, I was thinking about like the white pine has got like a lot of natural yeast on the needles, and I just think like that concept is something that not everybody knows about, and it's pretty neat. You can talk about how like you can make pine needle soda out of it pretty easily.
Pine needle soda?
Yeah, so you
What
put
are pine needle tea?
a bunch of pine needles in a jar, you put water, sugar, and then the yeast in the pine, on the pine needles eats the sugar and it carbonates the water over
Okay.
about 3 days.
Right on. I had some students 5 or 6 years ago try to make bread out of pine needle yeast. I don't recall if it's like the raisin kind of yeast or not, but they at least tried it, and they didn't die. I haven't had any students die on me yet, so far so good. But maybe that leads to a fun experiment, right? Like, who doesn't love soda? I mean, I know it's bad for me, generally, but I love me some soda. My wife and I have a lot of fun going on kind of scavenger hunts at random grocery stores when we're traveling to try and find the strongest ginger beer, non-alcoholic soda. It's called beer because it's strong. It's like super intense ginger ale. association with soda. It's a very happy set of memories with my bride, whom I like very much. So, we can hook into people's positive, and sometimes negative, but usually positive, associations like that by some kind of creative connection between the yeast on pine needles and soda. Okay? That's interpretation. That's a very successful way to do it. Sound good? Any other ideas? Alright. So, for next class, go ahead and commit to paper 3 ideas about the same tree or up to 3 different tree species here on campus. And what you might do, just like 3, 4, 5 bullet points that would go into that particular thematic point along that tree hike if you were designing a tree hike. But we're just going to do 1, 2, or 3 trees. And you can combine them all together as one, or you can do 3 separate ones, doesn't matter. Sound good? Cool, for next class, so on Monday. All right, so let's take a little bit of time to kind of step forward in this content development process, this content design process, to talk a little bit more about a very familiar thing for most of us, games, and a somewhat less familiar thing, game design. So, as you might intuit from having played games like tag, or freeze tag, or hide and go seek, or scavenger hunts, or whatever as a kid, games are generally pretty easy to pick up. Interactive, they require engagement, kind of by definition, and as it turns out, it is devilishly hard to design an easy game. So, the ease is competing with the complexity, the fidelity to what the game is about. You can have a very, very simple abstract game that could be about a million different topics because it's a very general thing. Tag is very abstract. But if we start to complexify tag with roles, so a modified tag game like sharks and minnows. Is anybody familiar with sharks and minnows? That's essentially a modified form of tag. It's much more complex, but it has explicit ties to predator-prey ecosystem dynamics, population dynamics, wildlife biology. So, ecosystem scale ecology. Pretty cool stuff, but, you know, it probably takes 30 seconds to explain the rules for sharks and minnows versus about 10 seconds or 5 to explain tag. Don't be it. Don't get caught by the person who's it. Whoever gets caught by whoever's it is it, right? A couple of sentences. Super easy. So, let's go through some hallmarks of what defines a game versus what is not a game. And then we'll talk about some design techniques that we use specifically for interpretation to make games a useful tool for us, for our specific needs. So, before we jump into the specifics of it, it is Valentine's Day, and today's class is dedicated to my sweet, sweet bride, Dr. Emmy, a veterinarian and PhD. That's right, she's twice as smart as I am. She is my chicky nuggy. And the reason why today is such a cheesy, fun day. Okay, moving on. Our goal for this class is not to be expert game players, it is to be expert game facilitators. To design games and then to deploy them and help our people, our participants play, whether it's a staffed game or not. Whether we're there in front of them sort of coaching, explaining, and moderating the rules as we go, or if we never actually meet those folks face to face and they're turning to the next page in the Junior Ranger guidebook and they find a game in there that looks like a lot of fun to play. Our role is to bring them through that game just like we're bringing them through the larger Interp that the game is a part of. Okay, so we want to learn to build useful and fun games from scratch, and more often there's an existing game that a lot of people are already familiar with that we can modify just a little bit and not have to explain, not have to play balance, not have to design from scratch, okay? So, games are as old as human civilization. Very likely, games are much, much older than human civilization by 100,000 years or more, right? So, the 20-sided dice that modern role-playing game, tabletop game users use in games like Dungeons and Dragons, very popular game right now with millions of players worldwide. That 20-sided die has been found as an archaeological artifact from ancient Egypt. It's like 5,000 years old. And it's exactly the same in its geometry as the dice used. You can go to Castle Perilous this afternoon and buy 50 D20s. Okay? So this goes right back to the beginning of civilization, and again, because games are easily deployable, you don't even need things like writing, which is a post-civilization invention, much, much younger than civilization, and so on and so forth. You don't need a game board, you don't need anything but at least one willing body, right? One person to play the game. So, let's tap into that sort of ancestral memory of lots and lots of different games and adapt games so you don't always have to start from scratch. For some of us who are real nerds, ludologists who study games. So, ludology, the study of games, pretty cool stuff. They've developed some things that will help us get there better and more efficiently. Okay, so a little bit of useful info from some of those experts. We could think about games as certain kinds of archetypes or classifications or groupings of type or style or how the game goes. So that involves things like it's satisfying to collect things, to gather stuff, to stack up piles of resources. So if you've ever played Settlers of Catan, anybody? Monopoly, the game of life, poker. It feels good to stack up a big pile of chips and then watch everybody else's soul just kind of deflate a little bit as you push them all in and you force everybody else out of the game for the night with a strong hand or a strong bluff. Okay? Collecting things is deeply wired into us. Humans every year stack up hundreds of billions of hours of human existence, hundreds of billions, playing games like Animal Crossing because it feels good to collect stuff. Probably the best example of this is any of the Pokemon games. Anybody ever played Emerald, Moon, Pearl, any of those? Right? What's the motto of the Pokemon universe? Not just the games. Gotta catch 'em all right? So that's very clever marketing speak, tapping into this human instinct for game playing and resource accumulation, gathering. Gotta catch 'em all. Gotta buy all the packs of cards. Gotta buy all the DS games, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So, a subset of that is going to be accruing points. Points are an imaginary and arbitrary resource. We'll talk about what resources are in games here in a bit. And you're just watching a score tick up. So there was a viral game around 2011, 2012 called Cookie Clicker, where every time you pressed a button, your factory made a cookie. And then you could like sell those cookies automatically and upgrade your factory a little bit. So the next time you clicked it, your factory made 1.1 cookies, and you could open up additional factories and upgrade them. Like you could employ your grandmother, who, spoiler alert, if you kept upgrading like the factory and the grandmother, eventually she became this like dark eldritch elder god that like devoured the universe at the end of the game, right? And the whole nonsensical storyline of it is just about clicking. So there were all kinds of stupid mods. People were like tapping, putting like vibration motors and springs on their mouse buttons and like wearing out hardware mice to have it like automatically click all night long for no good reason. There is no real benefit. It's all just a bunch of imaginary points. And ha ha, my grandmother just grew iron teeth and like devoured a village, like, fueled by my evil cookies or whatever. Just accruing points feels good. Losing points feels twice as bad as the bonus you get or the better feeling you get from gaining a point. So, if your game has the mechanic of being able to lose something, or the player can make a tactical or strategic choice in the game that leads to a loss of something, you need to make sure in your play balancing and design that you're rewarding them at least twice as much. Otherwise, it's going to be like This game is bad and I feel bad. I'm a bad person and so is this game designer. Okay? So, that's a very, very, very well explored thing. Okay? Cool. Collecting feedback. How am I doing? Social media is built on this. How many likes? How many views? How many subscribes? Okay? Collecting feedback is a very, very social thing. And a very, very powerful thing that hooks into lower levels of our brains. That's why social media companies are some of the largest and most influential, unfortunately, in the world. So, games like Never Have I Ever, or poker, where some would say, a lot of pros would say that you don't play cards in poker, you play what? You play the table, you play the other players. You're looking for tells. A little twitch of their eye like, I have no hand, but I'm bluffing right now with a whole bunch of chips. I'm trying to scare you. Okay? You play the other players. It feels good to exchange, and in a process called arbitrage, exchange at advantage. So games like No Man's Sky lately, Star Citizen, any of the like economic simulation games, Factorio, stuff like that. It feels good to like buy low and sell high, and stack up imaginary points or cash or other resources, and so on and so forth. Robinhood as a company famously gamified the stock exchange in this way, and they were printing billions of dollars, generating a lot of wealth. Quite a bit for a while until the meme stock apocalypse sort of exploded them and some others. Customization is also a thing. So if you've ever played as Ash in any of the Pokemon games or whatever, and then with some of the later ones, you can sort of put your own character in and just name the character, or maybe pay even sometimes real money to dress your virtual character in like a Fortnite shirt or something like that. Customization is a powerful thing. A lot of games' entire economic model, how they pay for the servers and the devs, is through customization, right? So go into the cash shop and get that gold bling bling for your AR-15 and any of the mindless first-person shooter clones, and you're somehow cooler to everybody else because your gun looks like it's wrapped in gold leaf. Or anime waifus or something, you know, like, why do we do this stuff? Why do people wrap their cars in vinyl? Because customization is fun, it feels good. So a lot of games are very successfully tapping into that instinct or that desire or motivation to customize. Finally, advancing or expanding your capability or growing, like training Pokemon up, amassing a bigger army or zoo or Pokedex, I guess, of Pokemans. StarCraft, if you're familiar with any of the real-time strategy games, the old Command and Conquer or Red Alert. Every match you play, you have to build up a tech tree so that you can build more advanced, more powerful units that are more expensive, but are way better at curb stomping your opponent's unlucky heroes. Okay? And finally, completion. So a whole bunch of arbitrary achievements with witty or punny names, right? A lot of Xbox games have these. This has been a thing for the last decade and a half, and some people just cannot resist seeing that little 100% and getting the achievement for getting all of the achievements, right? It's so meta. Achievement for achievements? Not even like actually playing the game to play the game. You're playing the game to do achievements. Think about that. That's weird. But it's a great way to make a game stickier or retain more people longer. So, there are some components in terms of the actual design of the game beyond just what's kind of the archetype that you wrap the game around, or the game design around. These are going to be a really important list. So let's take a second and capture these, give each one of these maybe a paragraph of space underneath to fill in the blanks on them. So, what's the central metaphor of the game? What's the core or basis of emotion for the game that you're designing or adapting? What are the rules and mechanics? We'll talk about the differences between those. Are you or are you not providing what's called equal initial footing for your various players, especially if they're fighting against each other or competing against each other in the game? If the game is, as it's called, asymmetric, you need to be very careful in that design so that one player isn't unfairly or unfunly advantaged against other players, unless that's the message you're trying to send. You can absolutely stack a game against your players if that's a core or important part of the message. There's still ways to make that kind of a game fun and even funny, okay? You need to explicitly choose and design very carefully around the balance of team play and or competition, unless it's a purely solo game. And even with solo games, if there are NPCs, if there are non-player characters or actors or agents within the game, maybe also sort of autopiloted by the game's rules or played by the player. So a squad-based tactics game like XCOM, where you're controlling 4 or 5 different squad members, is a teamwork game, but a solo player, okay? And you need to choose or set the amount of teamwork or balance of teamwork and competition. It could be pure competition, pure teamwork, anything in between. Teamwork within a team, competition against another team, for example. And all of that needs to speak to your reason for including this game in your Interp in the first place. What's the iterative or cyclic strategy feedback? We want this to be very quick. Talk more about that. What's the progression of the game, the start, middle, and end of the game? What are the tokens and roles required of the game? And how can we simplify this down to the minimum number needed to be effective? What's the internal economy of the game? What resources trade hands, at what rate, at what moments in the mechanics, and so forth? What is the role of you, the interpreter? Does this game only work if you are leading it and explaining and coaching people through? Or is this something that you set out into the universe and people play on their own and enjoy it and learn a bunch and really engage with your interpretive topic on their own? And finally, we want to have a very clear victory condition. What ends the game? Positively, victory condition, or what causes the game to end in calamity? We need to set those and make them very, very clear. So, we'll talk about how we start with the end on all of these games when explaining them. So, central metaphor. What are you wrapping the whole game around? In Sharks and Minnows, the central metaphor is that ecosystem dynamic, predators versus prey. And experientially, by running around themselves as sharks or minnows, the players get to feel and experience what it's like to be a predator. And if you don't catch anybody in this round of the game, you starve. Right? And if you do catch somebody, now you got another shark, because you have, metaphorically at least, gathered enough resources to reproduce and increase your predator population. But we get some interesting dynamics when we start running out of minnows and there are too many sharks, and sharks start starving, and so forth. Okay? Cool. All right, so central metaphor. What's it about? Another way to answer this question is, what's the thematic point that you're trying to design this game around? That's typically the central metaphor of the game. So if we're talking about making tree soda, you could have a Burger Time style game. Burger Time is a game from the mid-1980s on the original 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom in Japan. And basically, you're a chef running around a Donkey Kong-like level, and you're trying to assemble these burgers by running and knocking out the supports underneath them and avoiding Pac-Man-like enemies also running around that space. It is very loosely connected to making burgers. It feels like a Donkey Kong game for those of you who are familiar with those. But the game is about burgers, right? That's the central metaphor of the game. Cooking is hard. Okay. So, central metaphor of chess. It's a battlefield, right? We have knights and pawns, which are basically an old name or archaic name for foot soldiers. We have bishops and rooks. We have kings and queens. So those role names were sort of updated and modified by Western Europe when the Moors invaded Spain and France and so forth, and brought an earlier form of chess with them, a very old game. And it just made sense to call some of those characters or tokens on the battlefield of the board recognizable English, German, French, Castilian kinds of names, because it maps onto feudal warfare really well. All right, sharks and minnows we talked about. Anybody played Among Us? Red is sus, blah, blah, blah. Okay. What's the central metaphor of Among Us? I have sus agent provocateurs, but what's the metaphor of the game? What's the idea of the game? That the mechanics of running around trying to fix your ship or trying to murk people and not get caught. What's the central idea of that? Anybody?
It's like kind of like the power of information. So like they give a minority information that the rest of the group doesn't have.
Very good. So this is an information asymmetry game, right? Not everybody's on an equal initial footing because one of them's trying to get all stabby and the others are trying to not be all stabbed. Okay. Lord of the Rings. The original novels were about the horrors, actually, of World War I that Tolkien was responding to, but writing it immediately during and after World War II, where sort of the rise of mechanization in these, smoke-chugging factories and so forth are putting technological horrors out into the world in the form of, in that case, Uruk-hai, essentially magic bioengineered super soldiers, right? Orcs that could run by day and so forth, and so on and so forth, right? And to underscore the horrors of the world wars, he made those monsters pretty monstrous, right? So when they have a couple of hobbit captives, we have the line, "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys." And the hobbits are looking at each other like, wait a minute, where's the meat? Okay? So, big events can be the central metaphor. Warfare can be the central metaphor, something like that, all right? Monopoly was a game designed by late 19th, early 20th century social reformers who were trying to show the evils inherent in runaway free market capitalism, how it crushes actual human beings and grinds them down to nothing. If you're winning in Monopoly, it feels pretty good to stack up all those resources and properties and houses and hotels and railroads. And if you're everybody else, the game is explicitly designed for one person to pull ahead and then to use that advantage of being ahead to absolutely just demolish everybody else. Everybody else dies with a whimper, and one person is over there stacking cash and fanning themselves with Benjamins, all right? So, central metaphor, big deal. Without a properly identified central metaphor, your people are just playing a game, all right? So, tie this explicitly, make it very clearly the thematic point, the perspective about your overall theme and specific topic that you want to examine through the game, okay? Cool, all right. Emotional basis. We are all thinking, reasoning creatures, but we don't tend to live and behave according to our thinking and reasoning. We are profoundly emotional creatures first. If you're familiar with the term limbic hijack, when you're nervous or really angry or frozen in fear, those are emotional responses to your, when we talked about this one today, your interoception. Picking up on some extreme sensory input. Like, there's a train rushing at me. I'm going to freeze in the headlights and get splattered. Or I'm going to flee. I'm going to dump a bunch of adrenaline into my system and run. Or I'm going to do something else. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are the 4 limbic hijack responses. One level up from that is, how do I want my game to make people feel during or at the very end of it? So the game of life is based around happiness. there's no way for you to get knocked off the board in the game of life. Everybody makes it across the finish line. Some people have a little bit more material wealth accumulated than others. That's mostly random. You get a couple of very simple choices in the game, and otherwise you're just spinning the spinner till you cross that finish line and tallying up everything you got. Okay? That feels good. There's very little risk of, there's no actual risk of losing, but there's the perceived risk of not coming in first in the game of life. So it's a fairly simple way to make sure you have a bunch of happy players. You can have a game with a surprise twist ending and catch people kind of flat-footed and have people not go, oh man, that game was sick or fire. You can have them kind of gobsmacked and just going, well, that's certainly a different take on things. I'm going to go away from this now and have a long think by myself and reconsider my whole life. That's a valid thing, if that's appropriate to your topic, right? So don't shy away from games that cause surprise. Don't shy away from games that cause fear. By introducing things that folks hadn't thought about before that maybe it might be wise to think about. So if you want to talk about something like global climate instability or food insecurity or what it's like to be a refugee or someone seeking political asylum or something like that, you can personalize it. You can make this more familiar and immediate and visceral in terms of interoception. By triggering something like fear or anger, this is one you gotta be real careful with, right? Not everybody is emotionally mature, and so the anger response might be big. Disgust, revulsion. Think of all the Nickelodeon shows you watched as a kid with people getting slimed and stuff like that. Or there's a really old game show on Fox for kids where one of the things was you had to go through this big obstacle course, and one of the tasks you had to do on the obstacle course was find a flag inside of a giant 6-foot-tall nose that was filled with like this sort of pea soup green slime, and you had to reach up in there. It's cold and gross and wet and slimy and all this. It was just pea soup or whatever it is. Who cares? But to a little kid, on camera, that's a super gross out moment to reach up in there. And others were like, "This is the best day of my life," smearing it on their faces and then going on with the rest of the obstacle course, right? So disgust is okay, especially as long as we make it safe for people, safe and even funny for people to get grossed out, right? So when you're interpreting with a bunch of kids, have a disgust mechanic and make sure one of the parents, usually the popular outgoing one that all the kids just love on the field trip there, have that person get grossed out, and all the kids are like, ew, that's so gross, ha, comedy is someone else's tragedy, got you, bazinga, right? Okay. Fiero is that rise up out of your seat, muscles clenched, mouth open, kind of that I'm going Super Saiyan moment, for those of you familiar with what's going to happen next week on Dragon Ball Z. That's Fiero. So when your team scores the last touchdown in overtime at the end of the game, that's a Fiero moment. People, spilling their beers that were in their laps onto the people in the row in front of them because they're like, yeah! And the person in front of them was also like, yeah! And they don't even care. It's like, yeah, that was the game. That was the moment when I got beer rained all over me. That's called Fiero. The fist pumping, but not like Jersey Shore fist pumping, like I'm the happiest I've ever been kind of Fiero. All right, greed is an emotional response, and we can trigger that. And we want to be mindful about triggering that when that is appropriate. Okay, so in your game design, here's what you do. You start with your thematic point. What's the reason for the game, and why I think this game might be a useful way of interpreting this particular subtopic. And you hook your central metaphor to that. And then you can pick the kind of game that you want to design or adapt around that central metaphor. by picking what emotional response makes sense in my participants when we're talking about this particular subtopic from this particular perspective. Do I want folks to feel happy about it? Do I think they'll engage with this topic better if they're surprised, or they're disgusted by it, or something else? Okay? And in picking those two things, the central metaphor and the correct, most appropriate, or effective emotional basis, that's answering a ton of questions for you and letting you sort out a billion different game types and designs and possibilities so that you don't have the decision fatigue of, I gotta pick out of a billion different options. There's a much narrower set of games that are gonna be right for you for that particular situation, okay? So, you can avoid decision fatigue by starting with this. And the emotional basis is usually something that's in the middle of the game or the payoff is at the end. So, we're starting with the end of the game and we're designing backwards from the goal. Okay? Cool. Rules, found the time and the space, the physical space, the metaphorical space that you're playing in, and they scope the whole thing. This is a huge augmented reality game, or ARG, or alternate reality games are sometimes called, depending on the design. Or this is a super tiny game. This fits in an Altoids tin, and the whole game takes 3 minutes, start to finish. So play it a bunch of times versus an ARG, which can span years, and it's only ever played once. Okay? So the rules of chess are describing how the game starts, how the game ends, and then the mechanics are everything that happens in between. How the game progresses from its start through to its finish. Okay? So the rules are like, what's the ending condition, what's that victory condition, and so forth. And the mechanics are, what meaningful choices do my players have, if any? Some games have zero choice in them, and it's totally lockstep right through. Okay? We would call that an on-rails game. You can't actually move, the game mechanics move you through and you don't have choices about it. Okay? So, your mechanics can be simple or complex, but your rules and mechanics together, in terms of what the players actually hear from you, we're going to confine ourselves to 3 sentences or 30 seconds, whichever is less, for the purposes of this class. That's a hard design constraint. What that's going to do is stop you from writing a rules book that's a book. Because when people are standing in front of you trying to figure out this new game you're trying to sort of push on everybody, our brains are small and simple, and we can handle a couple of sentences in working memory. Anything more than that, and it's like, he's still talking. We're not playing, and I tuned out 5 minutes ago. I'm sure this game is awesome, but I'm just gonna kind of hang back and hope somebody else throws themselves on that grenade to save the rest of us, okay? So, 3 sentences, or 30 seconds, whichever's less, to get the mechanics and the rules across. That's about right for a Junior Ranger guidebook. For a 3rd grader seeing your game design for the first time, we can handle about 3 sentences of stuff. And more than that, we're gonna have to keep going back to the rules and mechanics description and pulling ourselves out of the game, disengaging with playing the game to figure out how to play the game when it's out of control, when it's too complex. Okay? Cool. Any questions so far? We're doing good? All right, cool. Let's take a real quick break, like 1 minute. Stretch your legs, use the restroom if you need to. Get some lacquer, nibble on your cookie. Grab some Valentine's Day chocolate in honor of my bride. Sweet, sweet ending. The double doctor. And we'll come back to it here in a second. Refreshed. Refreshed. All right. Okay. Good to go? Let's rock. Okay. So, one of your mechanics is going to be, what's the initial footing of the players? Is it like in chess, where there's the appearance, of both players have the same kinds of tokens arranged in the same way at opposite ends of a uniform and symmetric board? That's pretty fair. As it turns out, there is a first or second mover advantage to most sequence of turn games. So in tic-tac-toe, there's a very limited number of strategies that win. Tic-tac-toe is essentially deterministic. It's a very, very, very simplified form of chess or checkers, if you want to think of it that way. Very simplified. And so whoever goes first in tic-tac-toe, you run the game. Like, you can win every time. So we would say that tic-tac-toe does not have equal initial footing or equal initial standing or a fair chance to win the game regardless of who wins the coin flip on who goes first. Okay? This is called normalizing the players, where you divide away, mathematically speaking, anything that separates or gives an advantage to one side or the other, or one among multiple sides, for example. The old game called Chinese checkers has up to 6 players on a checkers-like hexagonal board, and that's about as fair as you can make a game like that. Checkers is another first mover advantage kind of game. Okay? So where you have a game that's asymmetric, where the roles are different, not everybody is doing the same thing under the same mechanics for the same reasons or goals to advance to the victory condition, you gotta play balance this forever, right? Anybody played games like Overwatch 2, or I don't think Fortnite has different roles. Everybody's more or less the same. It's just choices on where you drop on the island, right? Maybe Apex Legends has different roles. Games like League of Legends, where every player is playing a different hero and so forth, they have to play test those games and balance those games to keep them approximately fair-ish forever. Forever. There is so much mathematical complexity in making a game like that fair that there are entire teams of statisticians working at each of these major game companies, making a lot of money, trying to make sure that the tank characters are balanced with the glass cannon characters, balanced with the engineer utility character, or the medic character, or the spy character, right? All these different roles or archetypes, different mechanics for each one. Or the heavy in Team Fortress, right? But you gotta play balance that like crazy. So for interpretation, it can be very effective to get your point across if you have a bunch of different roles. And it can be really effective to help people understand the value or importance of those different roles if they're not well balanced. Like, if that imbalance is the point, that's a very powerful message. The person who is not able to access that victory condition the first time you play, because things are unfair and they're just learning the game, they get that message really fast, because all of us are wired to, if not win, not lose face among our peers. Not be embarrassed about losing. Okay? Cool. So, player normalization. Generally speaking, if the goal is fun, if it's a positive emotional beat that you want people to land on, then you want to make pains in design for getting to equality of opportunity. Everybody's got a fair shot at the game. Okay? Now, you as the interpreter, you are free to modify the game at the 50% mark. You're free to make up new rules halfway through, just to see what happens. Right? That's part of what keeps it interesting for you as the interpreter. You're facilitating this live. But understand that when you change the premise of the game live with your players, that is powerfully affecting everyone's sense of player normalization. And if somebody feels unfairly left out, Like, it's not part of the message of the game that I'm losing. I'm just losing because this is a terrible game, right? You've lost that person for the rest of the experience. They're going to be super put out for that. And that's fair and understandable. That's a valid response for them, all right? So, we also want to think about the balance of team player competition. Do we want pure competition, a so-called zero-sum game? So every spot that I take over on the board is taken over by me for the rest of the game, and everybody else loses everything that that spot is associated with. All the resources that are generated by that spot on the map, all the territorial or network or access control that's embodied in that spot on the map. That's called a zero-sum game. For every one that I take, that's one that you effectively lose. Okay? Pure competition. Pure teamwork is totally the opposite. So things like team building games, where we really can't lose, not really. The point is, let's all work through the problem posed by this game, the challenge that we face through the mechanics, and get across the finish line all together. We all stop playing once we all win, okay? That works for some kinds of games. And then anything in between, right? So you can have pairs of people as a team competing against other pairs of people, and that's a mix of team play and competition if that's appropriate for your particular topic, all right? And all of this is going to, again, be at your discretion. You can split up teams in the middle of the game like, oh, event XYZ has happened. All right, your teammate is now another competitor. Go. And you see how the game vibe kind of changes in that moment, and people learn something about what you're trying to interpret through that event that you're populating into the game. All of this sort of culminates and builds through the progression of the game. Games are like a nice beer or ginger beer, right? Every good beer has got a great head, maybe the foamy bits, right? Or if it's a Guinness, it's like that weird sort of half styrofoam looking head. And then a nice long drink and a wonderful long finish. Games are like beers, it has been said. And it all brings you to the victory condition, or the ending state of the game. All right, now everybody count up your poker chips. All right, now everybody, where have you got to on the map? All right, did you have a chance to customize your character the way that you wanted to before the timer ran out? Timer signifies the ending condition of that particular iteration of the game, that scenario or that sequence, okay? So the victory condition has to be crystal clear. We have to know what we're working towards in order for any of the mechanics to be evaluated, right? We don't really know or care what a knight does on a chessboard until we understand we're out for blood and we're going for the opposing color's king. Nothing else matters, right? So that knight is going to do some work for us. We may have to sacrifice that knight on that mission. So, with that very crystal clear and unambiguous victory condition, and you can have multiple, even competing ones, that's fine, but they need to be clear. They need to be intelligible and understandable and recognizable to your players immediately. All right? So, usually one, sometimes multiple. This affords people choice and strategic value in going one direction or another, picking one character or another, picking one role or another, making resource trading choices or tactical battle choices in the game, whatever the metaphor is. And they can sort of pick one victory condition or another. Okay? Now this is separate from providing a couple of different games for folks in a Junior Ranger guidebook. Or a Junior Ranger guidebook might have a dozen different games in it, if it's a big one. Those are each separate and distinct experiences, and they're each interpreting something different. So this is multiple parallel options in a single game, right? So adding more choices adds more complexity. We've got 3 sentences to work with this semester on each game that you design. So you have to make those symbolic endpoints, the king. Well, the king in patriarchal monarchies is the number one most valuable thing. So if we get that, we're done. You know you've got a clear victory condition if you can do it as part of one of those three sentences. Okay? Cool. So this helps us, or forces us, to be very efficient and ruthlessly clear. All right. So put a star by this one. It's got to have a good victory condition. When we're doing game design exercises in class, I'm going to go right here to make sure that this is finely tuned. The other parts can be kind of rough, but if we don't know where we're going with the game, we're going to go everywhere in all directions. And importantly, we as the players are going to go in a lot of directions that you didn't foresee or intend, which is funny when we're practicing these games in class, but it's literally dangerous. If a player doesn't realize that we're playing capture the flag and the objective is the other team's flag, what's to stop that player from validly, understandably, going completely the opposite direction, leaving the game field and wandering into traffic? Right? I mean, that sounds like a dumb thing, but if folks don't know, why wouldn't they just wander off? Right? We're wasting their time. So, we want to have our players know that they know that they know the game is over and what to move towards to get there. All right. And the process of getting there is called iteration. So, can you think of any game, video game, board game, card game, mind, theater of the mind game, like Mafia or was it Werewolf for a Night or something like that? Any of those. Can you think of a game that's broken into rounds, turns, cycles, iterations, all kind of the same thing? Any examples? Any examples? You know the answers to this, right? Help me check.
Rainbow Six.
Rainbow Six. All right. So, in Rainbow Six, which is first-person tactical squad shooter game, right? We have mission objectives, which are very clear, and you start the mission knowing what those objectives are. Very importantly, right? Then inside the game, with first-person shooters, typically you have one or more lives. In arena shooters like Fortnite, you have one life for that game. So, each engagement, each tango that you run across in your target-rich environment in Rainbow Six, each one of those is like, in a continuous game like that, the round, right? So you skirmish with that person, and you 360 no-scope them, or they get you with wall hacks or something, and that's the end of that cycle. So you respawn back at your base, and you try again. And the important thing here is, the shorter these cycles are, the faster you get to connect people with the effects of their tactical or strategic choices. So, in the game of life, you're just spinning the spinner and moving forward on the thing, and there's like twice where you can go left or right on the map, but everybody goes to the same finish line anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Okay? In chess, in speed chess, let's say, each person has 30, 45 seconds, 60 seconds to make their turn, and then the turn cycle passes to the other player. Then they have 60 seconds back. So that if you make one bad choice early on when you're first learning this game for the first time, you're not screwed the entire rest of that 3-hour chess game, okay? You can correct by getting rapid feedback on your strategy. This was my choice. Ooh, I didn't like that. I just lost some points. Let me try something else over here. Okay, that worked all right. Let me keep building out in this direction. Okay? So, this is super important unless, again, the point, the message of the game, the central metaphor of the game, is that your choices don't matter. As in, not exactly Monopoly, but games like Monopoly, like Sorry, where your choices don't really matter in Sorry. You're just moving pieces randomly forward. You don't have any choices, okay? But most games have a lot of very meaningful choices that impact your ability to connect with the victory condition. And so the shorter those turns are, if we're playing Sharks and Minnows for 30 seconds instead of 5 minutes, That's a much more effective, tighter feedback cycle, and people can see more directly, man, we're pretty top heavy on sharks in this food pyramid. We're gonna have some starvation problems real soon now. But we're seeing that because every 30 seconds we update our understanding of the game state because we're not all head down playing it, catching our breath, counting heads on this many sharks, that many minnows. Okay, we're running out of minnows. Let's see how this next round goes. Oh, everybody started it out. Okay. So, we want to prevent disillusionment, again, unless that's the point, by keeping those things very, very short. So, the more elaborate your game design is, typically the longer each of these rounds takes. The more thinking and strategic scenario playing out in your head that folks have to do drags out the length of those rounds to the point that we're so invested in trying to figure out the game that we're losing our hold on the metaphor. What's the point of the game? All right? So, shoot for 5 to 15 seconds. 5 to 15 seconds. Video games are pretty good at this, right? So, some of the largest games in the world have really short needs for your attention span. Are any of you familiar with the game Clash of Clans? How long is a match or a battle in Clash of Clans? At the most, it cannot go longer than how many seconds? 180 seconds. That's not long. And the company that made Clash of Clans, Supercell, they're like worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. Because you can pay them a couple of bucks, turn those real dollars into imaginary armies, and you get rapid feedback on strategy, and you see where your money went. Okay? So, 5 to 15 seconds as a rule of thumb for this class. We have a hard ceiling on 3 sentences, 30 seconds for explaining rules. This is a soft ceiling of 5 to 15 seconds for a round or turn-based game in this class, okay? It's just a good guideline for us. Okay, progression. We want games to build like a wave and then crest and break at the climax of the game, and then everything comes tumbling down, and everything is inevitable after that break. And we just sort of play it out and see how high the scores went, or see how completely face-tanked the unfortunate loser of the game was, and so forth. Okay? All right. So, a good game's progression, as you are learning, feels like a slow, low-key build. We're gaining momentum, we're gaining confidence in our strategic tactical choices, and then right at the critical moment, the last couple of rounds of the game, everything has been building towards this, and our choices now typically are fairly limited in that last round or two, but they're very, very powerful choices for how the wave breaks, how the game ends. Does it break in my favor and I win, or my gamble doesn't pay off and I get completely blown away, even though I tried my best on strategy? Okay? So, this feels good. That kind of, I'm surfing the flow, according to researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. The psychological state of flow is like surfing a wave. We are at the limit, but not too far beyond our capability and skill in this game. Okay, so the beginning of the game shouldn't feel like the end of the game. The first round should feel really pretty different than the last round. In checkers, it's all potential, round one. And the final round, it's like, man, I got nothing left. Just double, triple jump through everything I've got left with your king. Fine, okay, you win, and so forth. All right? So progression or advancement should feel exactly like surfing the wave. And it will break eventually, and that's okay. All right? So, collecting, customizing, learning, competing, exchange, exploring, narrative, right? We've seen these before at the beginning of the talk, but here, this is how we get there. These are the mechanics. So in Magic the Gathering, any of you guys play trading card games? Magic the Gathering, or in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon TCG, the first round, you're just trying to get resources out there so you can bring more effective and interesting things out to bear. Yu-Gi-Oh! In particular, there are a whole bunch of first round kill mechanics because the game is just sort of super bloated over the years with card combos. But for the most part, games of Magic, for example, they cannot be, except in a few very extreme circumstances, they cannot be shorter than about 3 or 4 rounds. You gotta have a couple of rounds to get your lands out so you can extract magic mana from those lands, put some spells into play, and attack your opponent's creatures or attack your opponent directly or mill their deck. Alright? So, however you decide to do this, pick the mechanic that fits your central metaphor and that fits the emotional beat you're trying to build toward. And there's your game. All right? You got the central metaphor, you got the victory condition, you got the mechanics to get there, and you got the emotional payoff at the end, the beat. The rest is just a whole bunch of window dressing, and that window dressing looks like some of these. Right? So I don't know if I have any bronies in the room, but customization, having your original character, this is a big deal now, right? Like, people pay a lot of money to artists on the internet to draw them like imaginary characters that are customized to the commissioner's, person who is commissioning the art's desires. People pay unholy amounts of money for Xbox and PlayStation games these days, where half the fun of the game isn't even playing the game, it's in making your character look like a meme or look exactly like you or somebody that you hate but dressed embarrassingly or whatever, in Mass Effect in this case, or in Baldur's Gate or whatever game that you're playing. Dungeons and Dragons related games are famous for this. Everybody's playing an edgy tiefling rogue. All right, so all those nonconformists look the same, don't they? Anyway, no, there's nothing wrong with tiefling rogues. Some of my best friends are tiefling rogues. Not really. Okay. So, one other thing we can do with progression, beyond just working out the mechanics of something like customization, unlocking different skins for a character, for example, is a progression for customization. We can change the difficulty. The game should typically be pretty easy at the start. But as you go, as you are running out of choices, as that wave is building, you might only have one or a couple of options in that critical last round where, you could have done a million different things, but this is the path you took and it's brought you right here. So that means that it's actually more difficult to play the game in that critical moment because you have fewer choices available, right? When most of your chess pieces have been captured, and it's down to like your king and queen, and your queen is eyeing your king and saying, "Baby, it doesn't look so good. I don't know how much longer I can protect you." Ah! And then, the game's over. You're in mate. Like, you're out of options. Does that make sense? But the weird thing is with that, as you crank up the difficulty, as you remove choices from players in a game closer to the climax of the game, that wave cresting and breaking, people are more invested because with fewer choices, we no longer have the easy sensation of the tyranny of choice. I could do a million different opening moves or combos in chess, but when I'm one round away from winning or losing the game, I've only got a couple of choices, and so that's the interesting part. That's where people get invested. We're all just waiting through the opening moves because, yeah, that's interesting, but, it could go a million different directions. When you're down to those last few seconds, it's fourth and inches, it gets interesting and tense, right? Okay. And for those of you who are not Taylor Swift fans, I feel sorry for you. What a weekend, right? Okay. So, leveling up in games, advancement, progression, that is a thing. So when you have characters or roles or tokens in the game that acquire skills or abilities throughout the game, that's the sense of progression. Your character levels up and learns new skills or spells or finds a +1 magic sword and now can hack at stuff better and overcome magic resistance, etc., you have to turn up the difficulty of the things that they're facing more than the level of progression that they've gained in that character. Does that make sense? So, if you level up to level 2 and you're still fighting a whole bunch of level 1 enemies, that gets boring real fast. The wave was building, and then the difficulty's gone back down, and now I'm on flat seas on my surfboard, just kind of paddling around, not surfing. Okay? So, that means the difficulty of the game has to keep pace with the advancement of the character if capability changes in the characters, if that's part of it. All right. Representative tokens and roles. Chess pieces, they have meaningful names. They're abstract shapes on the board, but they have very, very representational names. King, queen, rook, knight, pawn, bishop. Tokens on the game board. If you have something that increases the health or the vigor or repairs injury to your character in the game, it damn well better look like a red potion or something with a red plus symbol on it, like a First Aid Kit International semaphore, right? It's got to be instantly recognizable as what it does. So, in a game about trees competing for sunlight, like photosynthesis, a very, very popular and successful indie game about trees growing and shading each other out. It's a fascinating game design. Everything looks like what you think it should. So the game's super easy to get into because you know what trees do. They sprout from a seed or an acorn or whatever, and they grow. And that's exactly what the tokens in that game do. And the trees literally grow on the game board, and so the taller trees are shading out the shorter trees. And you can see that. You don't have to think about anything like sun angle or cosine angle of incidence, insolation values, 1300 watts per square meter at 35 degrees latitude north, right? You just look at the bigger tree shades out smaller tree. I get it, right? So for those of us who are mouth breathers and who hate math, your game should be just as fun as for the physics professor, okay? So make things look like what they should. Make roles, the behaviors of players, be titled like what they should, and so forth, okay? Plan your roles for even or odd numbers of people. We have to have an even number of players for chess. We have to have an odd number of players for certain other games, right? We have to have even numbers of players within teams. So we can have 3 players on this team, an odd number of players within the team, 3 players on this team, that's equal initial footing. And from there, we have a fair start to the game. But if we have 3 players and 2 players, that's one of these teams is 50% more resourced than the other one if the resource is the number of players, okay? So, design a game that can work for a couple of people, that can work for 20 people, that can work for 150 people, okay? Tag works really pretty well with 3 or more people. And so it's a game that has endured the ages. Chess has to be locked to exactly 2 people. And so it is getting out-competed these days by a lot of arena video games, Fortnite, where you just sort of throw open the server until it's mostly fullish, and then you start the match, right? And if there's 49 people or 50 people or 25 people, doesn't matter. You won't even notice. Huge differences, swings in the number of people playing that particular round, okay? Because you're busy playing the game. All right, we gotta stop there. That's time. I apologize. I was hoping to get us outside today. It's a beautiful day. But grab a cookie if you have it. Grab some chocolate on your way out. Happy Valentine's Day. Be with those you love. Appreciate those you are with. We'll see you Monday. Come back with 3 ideas on paper, ready to go for interpreting trees. And we'll continue talking about game design then as well. We'll finish that out and start prototyping out some games. That'll be fun stuff. See you then.